Mark Cuban asked by Twitter, publicly, he said, can anybody name any topic relevant to the presidency that President Trump could talk about in depth? So the question is there any topic about politics that is relevant to the presidency that President Trump, in particular, could speak about in depth? And Mark Cuban challenged anybody to provide an example, perhaps a video of him talking in depth on any topic at all. Now, the implication here is that if he doesn't have a certain level of expertise, he wouldn't be able to make good decisions. I pushed back on that a little bit by listing several things that I thought President Trump could speak about in depth, but they fall into the category of the way you operate as opposed to the details of the policies. So, for example, you could talk in depth about how to persuade, how to negotiate, how to make decisions in complicated situations. He knows about construction, so he probably knows more about building the wall than any other politician. He might know more about infrastructure spending than any other politician, just because he's sort of been around real-world budgeting. But how much does that matter, right? So what I responded with, in part, we had several exchanges, is that on first blush, it sounds like a really good question, doesn't it? If your president doesn't understand in depth any of the topics which are the subject of his job, your automatic assumption is, well, that's a problem, because these are pretty big, important things, right? But let me give you some context. The only reason you're listening to me right now is because I'm a famous cartoonist. Do you know what my expertise was in cartooning before I became one of the most famous cartoonists in the world? None. I just sort of figured it out as I went. I'm also a best-selling author. I've had a couple of books that were #1 New York Times bestsellers. Do you know how much experience I had as a writer of books before I became a #1 bestseller? None. Do you know how much experience I had before starting a couple of restaurants? Well, I'd worked in restaurants, but wasn't really any kind of an expert. Now, both the restaurants didn't work out, but most of that had to do with, things that have to do with restaurants and the economy and that sort of thing. And Mark Cuban had no experience owning an NBA team, but by all accounts, he did well. And I think the company he created and sold for billions, he wasn't experienced in that before he did it. So I have to think that most of the technology jobs that people are managing, they don't know the details of the technology. They know enough to ask some good questions, and that's about it. Now, in the case of a president making a decision, let's go through some examples and try to flush this out a little bit. Let's say the question was climate science, and that is the question right now. So the president's trying to decide, do I get out of the Paris Accords or do I not? Now, what percentage of all the things that one could know about climate science and also the politics of it, the Paris Accords, etc., what percentage of that full body of information should a president have in order to be capable of making a decision, given that the experts will be in the room with him and he'll be able to hear, the opinions from the pros and the cons? Does he need to know as much as a climate scientist? Now, keep in mind that some climate scientists disagree. So, which type of knowledge should he have more of? The one who says yes or the one who says no? So your first problem is, what does it mean to be an expert if the experts disagree? If the experts all agreed, Now, climate science is one of those cases where the experts are mostly on one side, so that's a bad example for this point. But in a case where experts disagree, let's say tax policy, that sort of thing, where you have more disagreement, how would it help you to be an expert on that if being an expert doesn't get you to the same decision? All right? Most of these decisions that we think are rational are not, and that's because we don't know the future and we never have enough information. So the magic of making decisions in a complex environment is the ability to reach into the complexity and pull out the things that matter. Let me give you some examples here. I told you before that I became a famous cartoonist without being good at cartooning, without being able to draw pictures very well, and without any experience in writing and no background in comedy or humor or any of those things. But what I recognized is that if I wrote about people's jobs, people would think it was funnier than it was, and they wouldn't care too much about how it was drawn, because it's so relevant to them, like, that's my job. So I looked at the field of cartooning, and I said, well, there are a million things I could be experts at. I could be an expert at drawing, I could be better at writing, I could know more about the technology of it, there's lots of different elements of it. But I correctly deduced that the only variable that would be predictive is whether I talked about people's own experience. And so when Dilbert was changed from a generic comic into one about the workplace, it took off. Now, I wasn't an expert really at any of those qualities that you need to be a cartoonist, but I did recognize the one thing that mattered, which is, am I writing something that the readers find relevant to their life? And getting that right was all I needed. Now fast forward to the election, presidential election. Most of you watching this know that I had a minor claim to fame by being one of the few people, and there were more of us, but percentage-wise, there were very few of us, who predicted that Trump would win from the beginning. And if you recall that ride, if those of you who were there from the beginning, the way that I did that was to look into this incredible, complicated situation of politics and all the people who were running and their different policies, and I didn't really understand much of any of that, not in any expert level or even really a functional level. But I still was able to pick the winner with confidence, because to me it looked like there was going to be one variable that ruled the other variables, and I happened to understand that variable, which is persuasion. And I saw in Trump a persuasiveness that I thought would overwhelm all the other variables. And in hindsight, I think that's actually what happened. Now people are looking at all the, did Comey do it? Was Clinton bad at what she did? There are always a million reasons after the fact. But I predicted publicly that there would be one variable that would predict the future. It's easy to fit your explanation to the past. Anybody can do that. But to predict is hard. So that's why I said from the very first, I'm going to use this variable to predict, because I'm telling you this variable will be the predictive one variable. And got the right answer there. Now, let's go to the economy. Is President Trump the biggest expert in economics? The answer is no. All right? He's not an expert in economics, nor have any presidents been experts in economics. But here's what President Trump did, correctly, I would say. He looked into this big, complicated issue of economics, and he said, what's the one variable that matters more than everything else? And do you know what the one variable is? Correct. Jobs. Now, if you're President Trump and you get the one thing that needs to be right, which is jobs, and there aren't that many levers to push for jobs, and we mostly know what those are. He looked into this complicated world and said, there's one variable that's predictive, jobs. I'm going to push that lever and push it and push it and push it. All this other stuff, the stuff that Krugman knows, the stuff that other economists knows, they're maybe important on some level, but if you're the decision maker and you get jobs right, that's pretty good. Now this also spills over into climate science discussion. Do you remember when President Trump famously, before he was running for president, called the climate alarmism a Chinese hoax? Now, clearly that was hyperbole. My interpretation of that is that it was a hoax would be, his usual hyperbolic talking. What he meant was that the belief that that we needed to do something right away about climate science was going to be good for China, and they're going to go along with it because it's good for them, bad for us. So, in a hyperbolic sense, that's what he was saying. Now, the hoax part is sort of the thing he called out. Out of all the variables, he didn't say, well, I don't believe the CO2 adds to heat. Or he didn't say, I think you got the measurements wrong. He called out one element of the entire conversation. And what's a different way to express the same thing with less hyperbole? He called it a hoax, but what's a different way to say the same thing without the hyperbole? What would be a different way to say the same thing instead of calling it a hoax? Mark always has the answer first. Unreliable. All right. Unpredictable. Not credible. Exaggerated, maybe exaggerated, we don't know. But hard to predict. So he's taken that one variable and said, it's hard to predict. Let's focus on jobs because we know that variable makes a big, big difference. And if the economies are better off, we're probably going to be in better shape to take care of climate change. So there are a few big factors here, which is the state of technology. I was just reading that there are now some innovations in terms of electrical generators that apparently use CO2 instead of water to create steam to drive your turbines. And, that sort of thing over the next 10 years is going to be expanding greatly. So if you only knew two things about climate science and you didn't know anything else, could you make a decision? Here's the two things. One, it's unpredictable. It's a big unpredictable thing. And even though we do predict that the temperature will go up, we haven't been good at knowing how quickly or how big a difference it makes. So even if it goes up, does that add more in CO2? Does it add more in terms of greening the environment because CO2 is good for the greenery? Or does it immediately turn negative and very quickly? It's all unknowns. So in an environment of unknowns, if the one thing you do know is that the technology is getting better really fast, and our knowledge of this climate science area is improving fairly rapidly, does it make sense to wait until you know more and you have better technology and you can take a better swing at it, and in the meantime you've protected your jobs? Now, there's no way to know that that's the right decision. But to say that, here's my point. I'm not saying that's the right decision. I'm saying that if he took his current knowledge, this is President Trump, if he took his current knowledge about climate science, which is maybe next to nothing, like most of us, right? We're not climate scientists. If he were to expand that next to nothing knowledge of climate science, the actual science of it, to let's say he worked really hard and got up to 40%. Can you imagine how hard it would be to understand 40% of climate science? I've got a feeling if you're a climate scientist, you're probably saying, trust me, that's pretty hard, right? Getting up to my level as a climate scientist, talking as a climate scientist to someone else, to get to 95% of what I know would take, 20 years of working in the industry and PhD and all that. So suppose President Trump got to the point where he could spend a lot of time and got to 40% of knowledge about climate science. Could he make a better decision? I don't know, because he got the main variables right. which is that there's uncertainty and we're getting smarter all the time. Technology makes a difference. Jobs will be affected and jobs make a big difference. He kind of got the big stuff right. That doesn't mean the decision's right. I'm just saying that he got the key variables right, and he didn't need to get into the details of, did somebody use satellite imagery to measure the seas, and if somebody else did it a different way, which of those two methods is the good way? Does the president need to know that? I don't believe so. All right. So there's your two most complicated topics. The economy, where he didn't need to know much more than jobs are good and high taxes on corporations are bad. If you know a few things, you're in pretty good shape to make some decisions, right? Climate science, the same thing. Now let's take another one. Let's say the fight against ISIS. Did President Trump do a deep dive into the differences between the Sunnis and the Shia and the centuries-old conflict in the area? Did he dig into the holy texts of the Quran and all the related subsidiary texts? Did he talk to Muslim experts to find out blah, blah, blah? Did he do those things? No, he didn't do those things. If he had done those things, what percentage of all the things you should know or could know about ISIS and Islam and all that stuff, what could he get to? 20% knowledge? If he really, really dug in, 30% tops? Would that be enough? Well, not only would it not be enough to really have a good picture, you'd probably fool yourself in some Dunning-Kruger Kroger kind of way into thinking you knew more than you knew and overruling the experts. That would be dangerous. So instead, what did President Trump do? He appointed Mad Dog Matthias to annihilate ISIS, to surround them and annihilate them. He got rid of the press in the area, gave Matthias lots of operating room, and he did the one thing that seems like it will really make a difference, which is kill every single person who identifies with ISIS if you can find him. Right? Now, probably that's the right decision. Things look like they're going in the right decision, and Trump did that knowing what about Islam? He's not an Islamic scholar. He couldn't give you a deep conversation about the differences between the Sunni and the Shiite sects. Is it sects? I don't know, branches, whatever it is. And yet there's 3 examples where he's probably doing the right thing without any of that knowledge. All right? And I think he could go right down the line. You'd find out that topics are either easy to understand, let's say the abortion topic. It's not hard to understand the abortion topic, right? You don't need to be a doctor to get the gist of it. So there's simple stuff like that, and I think Trump gets that right, because it's simple stuff. On the complicated stuff, no president's ever going to get more than, 20%, 40% knowledge on the topic about science and, the military and the economics. So he's got to look for key variables and say, all right, here's the 2 or 3 things in this big field, and I'm just going to push those buttons because we know that that's the only thing that matters.